Today we are going to discuss the specimen demo for Norma frontalis. Now the Norma frontalis is the frontal view of the skull. So whatever you are seeing over here is the Norma frontalis. This is the frontal view of the skull. Now what are the bones which form the Norma frontalis? So you are seeing over here we have the frontal bone. So this is the main part of the Norma frontalis. Along with that, as we come down, you can observe over here that we have the two nasal bones. So two nasal bones, small nasal bones which are joined with each other. So these are the two nasal bones. Then we have the maxilla. So this is the maxilla over here. So this is the two maxillary bones. So here one maxilla and we have another maxilla over here. So these are the two maxilla. Okay. So these are the two nasal bones, these are the two maxillary bones, and you have another bone, a single bone which forms the lower jaw, and this is the mandible. So single bone forming the lower jaw is the mandible, and as we come up, go to the lateral aspect of the cheek. So over here, when we go to the lateral aspect of the cheek, so more laterally if we go, this part, this bone is the zygomatic bone on either side. So zygomatic bone on either side. So you can observe over here. So these are the bones which we are mainly seeing in the Norma frontalis. Okay, so this is the frontal bone. To repeat, then we have the two small nasal bones which are forming the bridge of the nose. So these two are forming the bridge of the nose over here, and then you have the two maxilla, one maxilla here and one more maxilla over here, which forms the major part of the cheek and also the upper jaw, because this is the alveolar process of the maxilla which forms the upper jaw. Then you have the mandible over here which is forming the lower jaw, and it's a single bone, not like maxilla, it is a single bone. And then the two prominence of the cheek, this is the zygomatic bone and this is the zygomatic bone on this side. Now coming to the apertures which are present in the Norma frontalis, you have a big aperture over here. So this is the orbit. So this is one orbit and this is one orbit. And if you now observe the orbital margin, so this is the superior margin of the orbit, this is the inferior margin of the orbit, this is the medial margin. So you can see this is the medial margin of the orbit. Here is the medial margin. And as we go laterally, this is the lateral margin of the orbit. So this is the lateral margin of the orbit. Okay, so in this orbit you can see clearly this becomes the lateral margin. Some light, if it is there, no, it will be very nice. Some focus light, no? This is better now. So coming to the Norma frontalis, what are the cavities on the Norma frontalis? So you can see over here, this is one cavity and this is one cavity. So this cavity is for the orbit. Now orbit is a pyramidal shaped cavity which has an apex inside and the base. So if you see, this is the base which is on the surface. So this forms the base of the orbit. So this thing is a base of the orbit, and here also we have the base of the orbit, and the base is opening into the Norma frontalis. Now if we see the base, you have a superior border of the base. So this is the superior border of the base. Then this is the lateral border of the base. Then this forms the inferior border of the base, and as we go up here, you are observing the medial border of the base. This is the lateral, this is the medial border of the base of the orbit. Now coming to the superior border of the base, it is mainly formed by the frontal bone. So this is the frontal bone and a part of the zygomatic bone. Now this is the zygomatic bone which is forming the elevation or the prominence of the cheek. Okay, so a part of the zygomatic and a small part of the frontal bone is forming the lateral boundary of the orbit, whereas look at the superior border of the base mainly by the frontal bone. So this is mainly by the frontal bone, and a small part of the zygomatic bone may come, but mainly the superior boundary is formed by the frontal bone. Lateral boundary by the zygomatic bone, a small part of the frontal bone. Now coming to the floor, that is the the inferior boundary of the base. So this is the inferior boundary of the base, which is mainly formed by the maxilla. So this is the maxilla and this is the frontal process of the maxilla which goes up. So this is mainly by the maxilla and the zygoma. So it's also the zygomatic bone and the maxilla, and you have a suture over here which is called the front zygomatico-maxillary suture. Zygomatico-maxillary suture. So mainly by the zygomatic bone and the medial part is by the maxilla. Coming to the medial boundary, so if you go to the medial boundary, it is mainly by the frontal process of the maxilla. Now this is the frontal process of the maxilla. So this frontal process of the maxilla goes up and joins the frontal bone at the frontomaxillary suture. This is the frontomaxillary suture. So this part of the frontal process of the maxilla has a crest. So this part has a crest, which is called the lacrimal crest. So this is the lacrimal crest, which will be in the medial boundary of the orbit. So these are, to repeat, the boundaries of the orbit are, you have the base of the orbit which is seen on the normo frontalis. It has a superior boundary, a lateral boundary, an inferior boundary and a medial boundary. So the superior boundary mainly by the frontal bone, the lateral boundary frontal and zygomatic bone, the inferior boundary is by the maxilla, okay, and also the zygomatic bone, the maxillary process of zygomatic bone, and the medial boundary will be formed mainly by the lacrimal crest of the frontal process of maxilla and also by the frontal bone. So this is forming the boundaries of the orbit. Now coming to the boundaries of the nasal aperture. So this is the nasal aperture which is seen on the normo frontalis. So this is the whole thing is the nasal aperture. Okay, so this is the nasal aperture which is seen on the normo frontalis. The nasal aperture is formed mainly by the maxilla, because this is the frontal process of maxilla which will form the sides of the nasal aperture, and inferiorly the base of the nasal aperture is by the maxilla. The intermaxillary suture may come here sometimes. These are the two maxillary bones. So this is also by the maxilla and the intermaxillary suture, and there is a prominence over here which can be seen, and this prominence over here is called the anterior nasal spine.